Remember God of War? No, not that one.
Zeus, your son has returned! I bring the destruction of Olympus!
The original God of War is a title upon which the House of Sony built its name during the PS2 era. It's one of the few titles I remember being popular enough to cause neighborhood kids to flock to the home of whoever was lucky enough to have their parents buy them a copy. Being a GameCube kid at the time, I didn't actually get to play the game until much later after its release, at which point I was already firmly enraptured by the Devil May Cry franchise. Yet I do have generally positive, if not vague, memories of the original God of War when I did eventually play it, and with the opportunity afforded by the new PS Plus Premium tier, I decided to go back and relive the classic. The question is, did I find a timeless masterpiece or an experience too weighed down by dated game design to hold up to modern standards? Find out in this video. Developed by Sony Santa Monica Studios, God of War was designed to be the pinnacle of the action-adventure genre.
God of War is our attempt to really elevate the action-adventure genre to the next level. We wanted to bring combat, exploration, navigation, puzzle solving, all of sort of the classic elements of the genre, but we wanted to bring those to players in a fresh way, in a way that they haven't really seen before.
We'll look at how close it came to these goals in turn, but first let's take a look at the story and how well it holds up in the modern era. I can say without any preamble, God of War's story is still great to this day. Look, I know it's become vogue in some circles of gaming culture to pretend that before the 2018 reboot, God of War had nothing to offer but an angry man-child. Yet this game stands as a rebuttal to that line of thinking. Ares, the God of War, is unleashing havoc upon the world, while Zeus has forbidden the gods from directly intervening. With her namesake city falling under the mad god's ire, Athena turns to the one mortal with a chance of killing a god: Kratos, the ghost of Sparta. Kratos was a Spartan general trained by Ares to be the perfect killing machine, being granted the blades of chaos to wreak havoc in his name. But after being tricked by Ares into committing a tragedy that left him with his pale white skin, Kratos lives upon the stormy seas of the Aegean, beset by nightmares of his past atrocities. Kratos offers to aid Athena upon a belief that by completing this task, the gods will free him from his nightmares.
And if I am able to do this, to kill a god, then the visions, they will end?
Complete this final task, and the past that consumes you will be forgiven.
And what follows is an epic tale across Greek mythology as Kratos seeks Pandora's box in the hopes that will grant him the power to kill a god and possibly find redemption. Throughout the course of the game, you'll come to discover what caused Kratos to be the broken man he is today, and what led him to where he is at the game's memorable opening, standing on a ledge, seeking to end his own life.
After 10 years of suffering, 10 years of endless nightmares, it would finally come to an end. Death would be his escape from madness.
Rick and Morty has some fun critiques of stories that start at a climax just to flash back to a less interesting point.
You like that? You want me to cut to 3 weeks earlier when you were alive?
And while funny, it certainly doesn't apply in each case, and I would argue God of War is an exception. God of War's opening serves as a hook for a character that would otherwise be unsympathetic.
Thank the gods you came back for me!
I didn't come back for you.
No!
Kratos is definitively not a hero. And while he may be on a heroic journey in a classical sense, any actions that we define as heroic today are at best incidental. What little interactions he has with NPCs throughout the game tend to be dour or outright hostile.
I know who you are, Spartan. I know what you've done. I would rather die than be saved by you.
PC Carson, who you're probably familiar with if you're black and grew up in the 90s, imbues Kratos with a humanity that you wouldn't think possible if you're only familiar with the highlights of Kratos' journey.
By the gods, what have I become?
It honestly makes me wish he was kept for the reboot, as his performance here reminds me of a depth of Kratos that I had forgotten was there. A good story is timeless, and I can happily report that if you play God of War today, you're getting a tale reminiscent of classic Greek tragedies, and one that stands head and shoulders above most gaming narratives today. My overall memory of God of War's combat was that it was hard, but not necessarily complex. Well, I'm happy to report that the combat in this game holds up astonishingly well and is very engaging despite being held back by some design decisions and some absolutely infuriating combat encounters. From the moment you pick up the controller, combat in God of War feels gratifying. Kratos is immediately powerful and able to juggle enemies with a combination of light and heavy attacks, launchers, and throws. One of the things that stood out to me upon this replay was the ability to throw enemies regardless of whether Kratos is in the air or on the ground. Though it's a simple mechanic, the fact that some enemies can be thrown repeatedly allowed for some interesting and fun combos. In terms of defensive options, Kratos is able to parry most enemy attacks and roll with the right stick to keep himself out of harm's way. Kratos can cancel into either of these actions, rewarding those players with quick enough reflexes to keep their momentum going. This idea of momentum is highlighted by the combo counter, which with certain combos can reach ridiculously high numbers. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the most memorable, if not innovative, aspect of God of War's combat, which are the QTEs, or as the game calls them, minigames. It's easy to excuse God of War's QTEs as mindless, but I think we forget how influential these were on the industry as a whole. At one point it seemed every game had a QTE event or finisher, and it's easy to see why. In God of War, they serve as catharsis, topping off a dominant display of skill or a visceral realization of payback after a tough fight. The animations on display are incredibly well done and tell the rage that Kratos feels more effectively than any other aspect of the game. They also serve strategic purpose, as certain enemies killed in this fashion will always grant you either health or magic. My only critique of the system is that I would sometimes run into glitches where certain enemies simply would not respond to the QTE prompts, leaving Kratos failing for a grab or failing a finisher. Otherwise, they remain as satisfying and fun as I remember from my childhood. In total, you'll have 2 melee weapons and 4 magic abilities to wreak havoc with throughout your playthrough. And while that may sound like a lot, these options are limited by the upgraded magic system. Keep in mind, however, that I played on hard, so these critiques are tailored to that specific experience. To use these options to their fullest, you'll need to upgrade them with the currency you get from defeating enemies. The problem is, these upgrades are expensive and don't tell you what's on the next tier of abilities until you actually purchase them. This does force you to be strategic in choosing what to upgrade, as the difference between a level 1 ability and its maxed out version is astounding. For example, this is what Poseidon's Rage looks like at level 1.
Well, that's nice.
And this is what it looks like at max level. Nevertheless, I can't help but feel that the high cost of these upgrades comes at the expense of player expression, as you'll be forced to be conservative and pick only 1 or 2 abilities to focus on for a majority of the game, which will likely be your default weapons and 1 magic ability. Now, by the end of the game, I was able to max out all but 1 of the upgrades, but that only happened well into the final act and after a ton of exploring for secrets that a lot of players may not be willing to do. This is compounded by the fact that you don't receive the second melee weapon until midway through the game, and it has a remarkably smaller moveset than the Blades of Chaos. Add to that, all other abilities are limited by your magic bar, which even when fully upgraded only allows you to use your most powerful magics a few times. If you upgrade the Blades of Chaos to level 2, you'll receive a devil trigger in the form of Rage of the Gods. Even on hard, it basically functions as a win button because of how powerful Kratos' melee combos become, even managing to do more damage than his magical abilities. Unlike a devil trigger, Rage of the Gods cannot be deactivated and takes a long time to accumulate, meaning many players may be overly cautious and not use it as frequently as they probably could. All these aforementioned limitations are obviously in place to balance the game's combat. As if magic were more accessible, Kratos would be absolutely unstoppable. Yet it ultimately amounts to a system where you feel like you basically only have 1 weapon, with magic being used only in the most dire of situations. If you play on lower difficulties, likely these limitations won't feel that restrictive, but as this was my experience, I thought it helpful to share. The philosophy behind God of War's combat encounters is to typically throw you in an arena full of enemies, with the difficulty being determined by the specific combination of enemy types you'll have to manage and prioritize. Perhaps you'll face Gorgons with the ability to turn you to stone and set you up for one-shot kills. Or maybe it'll be a Minotaur that will try to mix you up with a string of blockable and unblockable attacks. Or maybe it will be those awful satyrs who will counter your every move and leave you ready to break your controller. Even the most basic enemies can surround you and stun-lock you to death. This is why you can't just call God of War's combat button mashy. Most enemies will only endure a set number of attacks before they become immune to hit stun and start retaliating. Since Kratos doesn't have that same luxury, your role as a player is to make sure your enemies never get a turn. This is most easily accomplished with God of War's most iconic combo, square, square, triangle. This combo has been seen as emblematic of the lack of depth to God of War's combat, when really it's simply the most straightforward and consistent way to deal with the overwhelming odds the game throws at you. The last hit of the combo almost always guarantees enemies are stunned or end up in the air. This allows you to follow up with an air or ground combo to juggle them, and as soon as they recover, you can repeat the tactic to ensure they never get a chance to strike back. This obviously isn't foolproof, as rarely are you able to catch every enemy on screen with it, and Kratos can be interrupted before the all-important last hit comes out. This actually encourages experimentation, as some enemies are more susceptible to various attacks than others. Minotaurs can be stunned locked by Kratos' R1 combo, which I thought was useless up until this discovery. Or take these burrowing enemies. I was having trouble being stun locked by them until I discovered that they can easily be dispatched by a grab. And with satyrs, well, there really is no one-shot kill for them, but you can launch them into the air with Kratos' flip move. I really think the game could have used some description of what these moves do, because their utility isn't obvious, and when combat is challenging, you're more likely to simply rely on bread and butter combos than taking risk with new moves whose utility you don't quite understand. I remember this game being full of amazing boss fights, but surprisingly there are only 3 in the game, and none of them are what I'd call great. Each of them had mechanics that seemed designed to frustrate rather than challenge, a critique that features quite prominently in my review. Fair warning, however, discussing this will involve spoilers. The Hydra is the game's first boss, taking place on the game's opening level. It's a really epic fight that's super cool in scale, but fairly basic in terms of mechanics. Each of the heads only have a couple of moves that can be easily avoided, and given that this is your first boss fight, on hard, Kratos isn't yet strong enough to do a lot of damage to their health bar, extending the length of the boss fight well beyond the point where the novelty is worn off. What's worse is that when you get to the final Hydra head, the only thing it adds to the boss fight is an annoying move where it knocks you all the way to the bottom of the stage, so you have to spend a few minutes climbing all the way back up. It doesn't even do damage, its sole purpose is to literally waste your time. The second boss is the Minotaur, which occurs halfway through the game. Aside from this enemy type being a bit overused, presentation-wise, this is an immensely cool and stylish boss, which is why it's so disappointing that it's not a fun fight. Most, if not all of his attacks can be avoided by simply jumping and using air combos, but Kratos is pretty powerful at this point, so you'd assume that you can end it quickly by being skilled. Well, not exactly, because when you do enough damage to the boss, he'll run all the way to the back of the arena, leaving it open for a QTE. The problem is, if you don't start running immediately, and I mean immediately, you will fail a QTE and will have to do this portion of the fight all over again. I'm not a developer, I'm just some random guy, but I really don't understand the design philosophy here. If you're able to get the boss in a down state, then clearly you've shown competency with the combat system, which is what I thought boss fights were meant to assess. So why does it feel like I'm being tested on how fast I can move Kratos from point A to point B like I'm playing Mario Kart? And then there's Ares, the final boss, the source of all of Kratos' torment and pain. The first phase of this fight proceeds how you'd expect, a one-on-one fight of epic proportions where you bring to bear all the skills and upgrades you've accumulated throughout your playthrough. And if you come into this fight with a fully upgraded magic bar and a stacked Rage of the Gods meter, you can decimate Ares in less than 2 minutes.
You are no warrior.
Then the fight switches to a pocket dimension where Ares challenges Kratos to save the apparitions of his family from himself. It's thematically poignant, but mechanically obnoxious, because you have to defend your stationary NPC family from what feels like hundreds of mini Kratoses. As with all things, your personal skill will determine how long this takes, but this was a complete momentum killer for me, requiring absolute precision in terms of when I use my abilities to ensure that the family wouldn't die. Even with the ability to recharge the health, if you get caught in a combo or a grab, you'll only be able to watch helplessly as their health bar melts, and you have to do this section all over again. The only saving grace to this section of the fight are the story elements and watching Kratos fight desperately to find redemption.
Do you see, God of War? You took them once, but you'll never have them again.
The final portion of the fight sees you lose access to the Blades of Chaos, Rage of the Gods, and all your magical abilities. Instead, you get to fight with a giant sword with a completely new moveset. I feel like this was a design staple of games back in the PS2 era, but I absolutely hate it when games switch up their mechanics in the final boss. You spend hours learning how to master the mechanics and the tools given to you, only to have those thrown out the window when you face the game's ultimate challenge. But it's not just the fact that you have to learn a new weapon against the final boss, it's also that Ares can kill you in 1 to 2 hits, while you have to contend with the weird tug-of-war mechanic where both Kratos and Ares gain health based on how much damage they do to each other. This can make the fight go on longer than it has any right to, and I can't tell you how many times I nearly had Ares dead only to have him go to nearly full health due to this one unblockable move. His moveset also has randomness built in, where sometimes if you get him in a block string, you'll be able to lock him into a QTE that you can exploit for big damage. Other times he simply counters you and takes away all of your health. It made it so that winning felt like lucking out on certain exploitable movesets more so than becoming better at the fight. I say 80% of general combat encounters feel like a solid and fair challenge, meaning as long as you're careful about using your magic bar and utilize some solid strategies, you'll be able to overcome them even if it takes a few tries. The other 20% however feel like they're designed to simply frustrate and annoy more than anything else, but those are tied to level design, so let's discuss that now. At the time of its release, level design in God of War expressed a sense of scale unseen for a PS2 game. And while it obviously can't hold a candle to the massive worlds we see in today's games, I would still say it's impressive. Levels in God of War will take you through vast deserts, immense temples, and even the depths of Hades, all rendered with impressive background effects and elements. What's more, load times are practically non-existent, and levels transition seamlessly between one another to the point where it almost approximates an open-world game. When it comes to actually playing the levels, you'll find that most have you travel from room to room, solving puzzles and defeating enemies. However, I feel God of War's levels go above and beyond, rewarding players who are willing to explore. Venture off the beaten path, and more often than not, you're likely to find an item that will either help upgrade Kratos' health or magic. There are enough hidden areas strewn about to feel rewarding, but not so many things to do that you feel distracted from the game's combat. It's really solid level design and shows that action games don't need to have a lot of fluff to feel rewarding. However, there are a few things that really show the game's age and make it hard to blindly recommend everyone play this game. In modern game design for the action-adventure or action game, traversal is simply meant to be a palate cleanser between high-intensity moments such as set pieces, boss fights, or very tough combat challenges. In God of War, however, traversal is mixed with combat in the most obnoxious of ways. Climb across any of the game's ropes or walls and you will likely find yourself surrounded by enemies and forced to use a limited moveset to deal with them. It would be fine if there were only a few of these in the game, but unfortunately, they're peppered throughout the entire experience. They don't really add anything to the game except making getting from point A to point B as frustrating as possible. This is one of the few times I think would actually be appropriate to describe level design in a game as mean-spirited. Most of my death throughout my playthrough came from platforming challenges. To the point where sometimes it felt like I was playing a sadistic version of Crash Bandicoot as opposed to one of the greatest action games of all time. Look at this climbing challenge in the depths of Hades. Not only do the walls rotate, but they're full of spikes that will send you falling all the way back to the ground if you get hit by just one. It's like the developers knew this section was obnoxious because in the HD collection, you actually get a trophy for climbing the wall without getting hit. There are numerous sections and levels like this where developers seem to just want to screw with the player. There is this one hallway midway through the game where you have to navigate a bunch of flaming boulders. You have to find the one door among 9 that leads you to the next part of the level. And as far as I'm aware, there is nothing to indicate which door is the right one, leaving you to simply do trial and error. Sections like this make me think a modern gamer who wanted to try out God of War for the first time would simply not want to finish the game. And that's not even the worst example. That honor belongs to this section where you have to kick this soldier up an incline while fighting enemies. And these aren't your regular enemies. These are some of the toughest enemies in the game. Naturally, Kratos cannot fight while pushing the cage up an incline. So if you fail to place it on one of 3 resting points up this hill, you'll have to watch as it helplessly slides all the way back down to the bottom while enemies continue to spawn ad nauseum. Be forewarned, if you jump back into this game, you are going to probably have to deal with more sections than you think that make you want to tear out your hair. Still, these are very impressive levels even to this day and show a sense of scale that informed later games in the series. So is the game worth playing today? Upon its release, God of War met with universal acclaim, resting at a 94 on Metacritic. At that time, it would have been very hard to call that level of praise unjustified because there is simply nothing like it on the market. Developers nailed their goal of setting a new bar for storytelling and adding a sense of scale to level design unseen at that point. And while I don't think they managed to top Devil May Cry's combat, which released 4 years earlier, it did carve out its own space for uniquely expressive combat with QTEs that would soon become widespread across the industry. In 2022, these strengths are diminished while its weaknesses are magnified. Trolless level design, time-wasting puzzles, and limited bosses will all struggle to keep the modern gamer's attention when there are so many other games to play. However, if you are a fan of action games or even just a fan of gaming history, I would say God of War is definitely worth playing in 2022. If you liked that video, please consider subscribing for more content surrounding action games and difficulty. I'm amazed that people have started to engage with some of my content, and I'm very grateful for those who have decided to take a chance on this channel. Thank you so much for your support. This has been Harlan Gaming,